All right, well, we're 3 minutes in. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So let's get the show on the road. I have here our wonderful guest speaker, Cindy Krum. She's the CEO of MobileMoxie and author of Mobile Marketing, Finding Your Customers No Matter Where They Are. She speaks and trains people around the world in mobile marketing and mobile SEO, and is credited at being able to accurately predict changes that Google will make before they are made. She's got that SEO clairvoyance, what can we say? So very excited to have her on as a guest speaker talking about mobile SEO. Her company, MobileMoxie, is the first mobile-focused SEO toolset with tools like the SERPerator and PageSpeed, which lets users preview search results and websites under a variety of different conditions that can impact their marketing success. As I'm sure you're well aware, Google's placing a lot more emphasis on page experience, and you get kind of glimpses into what the robots would be looking at in terms of what they see on the mobile devices. MobileMoxie has also recently launched a set of Datalyzer tools for mobile pages and search results, so you can see the changes of content over time and compare the contents of your pages. And so here we are. I'll pass the baton then over to Cindy.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for the fantastic introduction, Bernard. I'm super excited to be here talking to you guys about mobile SEO and just how to wrap your brain around it and succeed. Like Bernard said, Google has been putting a much more significant emphasis on everything mobile, and there are good reasons behind that. So my goal today is to talk you through a lot of the basics of mobile SEO, why it's important, what makes it different, and how you can succeed. I normally talk to SEOs, and often my talks are pretty technical, but I've tried to rein that in so I don't bore you guys to death. And I'm going to try and make it as easy as possible. And I know you guys are probably already familiar with ClearScope, so that means you're advanced in some ways, and we'll be looping that kind of understanding in with how it fits with mobile. So let's start with some pretty basic concepts. Mobile and the landscape in mobile has continued to change, and what that means is basically it's continued to grow. As time progresses, more and more people are relying more and more on mobile technology, and that includes phones and tablets. But as we move into the future, that's going to include more things that are less traditionally used for Google searches where you type things in, and more related to voice activation, voice interaction, and the Internet of Things. And one of the technologies that makes that possible is the move towards 5G. 5G mobile connectivity makes everything faster and gives companies the ability to do a lot more processing and adapting of their content in the cloud. And it also helps Google in some ways get a better understanding of what's going on faster. And so they use things like sensors and all of their connected technology to talk to each other and to inform each other of what's going on, to give a search more context. And so what I think you can expect as 5G becomes more and more widespread is we're going to see more and more connections between our phone and our other devices that you wouldn't think of as necessarily mobile technology, but they use the mobile technology to give them information about where you are, what you've been doing, what you've been looking at, and what you care about. And so this more connected experience is something that will really affect how consumers find and consume both digital technology as well as e-commerce types of situations. And just all you have to do to understand the changes that we've experienced is to think about the past couple of years, and especially during the pandemic, how so much of e-commerce went online. And I think that's probably also fit into advancing the way that search can work and the way that search will work, as companies found that it was absolutely integral to their existence to have a good presence online and to have a good experience online. And so 5G is just going to feed that. So in terms of demographics and who is using mobile the most, a lot of people might assume that it's kids in ages 18 to 24. That's not necessarily true. While kids are relying more and more on phones, it's almost completely widespread. And the age groups of people who are actively using their phone to do searches and to look online or even to interact with apps, it's quite high for even spending a pretty high amount of time interacting with the mobile devices. And what I'll tell you too about a lot of these graphs, these are not my graphs and not my research. I try and give credit to everyone who's done the research. But the idea of thinking that mobile technology is just for the young is really not true anymore. It's really widespread. But even still, that's true. Almost half of the mobile users are younger than 25. So in terms of usage, there are a lot of people under 25, but they're not using mobile to the exclusion of everything else. And there is a high rate of at least some interaction with the demographic that's above 25. And of course, there are regional trends that change based on the accessibility of mobile devices, the accessibility of fast internet connections, and the accessibility of alternatives like computers. In some countries where computers are more expensive or harder to come by, they kind of skipped straight to mobile and tablet technology. And so you have to, if you're doing any kind of international project, it helps to not just compare overall totals of how much mobile traffic you're getting in this country versus that country, but to compare it with the rate of adoption in the mobile technology to know what is normal, what you can expect, and to have realistic expectations for what can happen and what you're measuring and what you're comparing to make it more of a fair comparison. Now, the other thing to know is that if you are doing anything that's OS specific, so that means OS is operating system, so iOS or Android specific, that those demographics change country by country as well. In the US, things tend to be pretty close to half and half, half Android, half iOS users, but that's not true everywhere. And in some places, and especially in more developing or growing economies, Android usage tends to be higher because Android phones tend to be a bit cheaper. And so knowing that breakdown can also help you decide if you're launching an app, where should you launch? What should you build first? Should you be focusing on one operating system or the other, or should you be focusing on web, which is kind of an ever-present question. And you can see this kind of gives the same thing that says, basically the idea here is in the earlier days of mobile, starting, in this graph in 2012, there was a more diverse set of operating systems out there. We had Samsung, operating devices, BlackBerry and Windows, and Nokia also competing, and Symbian. And now the world is basically just iOS or Android. It's one or the other, and those other phone brands still exist, but they use the operating system of either iOS or Android, and almost always if it's going to be Android if it's not an iPhone device. Because iPhone manufactures the hardware and the software, and Android is happy to be on any hardware. So what that gets us to is the question that's come up for years is, should I build an app or should I build a website? And there are pros and cons for each, but I want to mention a couple things here to just educate you on how data is being presented and in some cases manipulated to understand and really evaluate pros and cons. In general, when we talk about building apps, apps tend to succeed more for well-known businesses and tend to be a support of an existing brand. Now, in some cases, companies will want to be an app-only play, and that's usually when they have a lot of backup funding and a lot of ability to get the word out through really strong marketing budgets. But if you're a company that's just starting and you don't have big VC backers or you don't have a lot of funding to get started in an app-only play, it ends up usually being harder to find apps that you don't know exist and easier to find websites that you don't know exist. So for instance, when people go to an app store, iOS or Android, they usually are doing branded app searches. They're searching for Uber, they're searching for specific options. They're not browsing in the same way that people browse on the web. They're not going to the App Store or Google Play and searching for best run tracker. They do those searches in Google to read evaluations and to learn and get ideas. And by the time they get to the store, they're usually making branded searches. So from an SEO perspective, this is important because you can optimize rankings in the app stores, but people aren't searching. They're not even submitting the queries that are unbranded or that are browsing kind of queries as much. Those kind of browsing queries happen much more in Google. So there's strategy here if you're deciding, what are we trying to do and what's going to be our biggest hurdle. Discovery and brand awareness can be a hurdle if you're a new company. And so that's one reason that using web can make your life a little bit easier if you're on a really limited budget. Now, the converse of that, what app developers and app companies will tell you is that 80% of people's time on their mobile device is spent in an app. And that sounds like a lot. Sometimes it's even higher for some age groups. But what you have to understand is that 80% is consumed primarily by the big 5 apps, and by apps that have a long use case, a long-term use case, or a long time period use case. So something like Netflix, you're in the app watching a 2-hour movie, that's going to change the statistics when it compares to your, Wells Fargo banking app. You don't need 2 hours to do your banking, but to enjoy a good movie, you need 2 hours. And so the same is true with things like, the biggest apps in the app stores are often Facebook, YouTube, Netflix, and Google Maps. And those things, all of those use cases are a more long-term engagement than other things. Now, the other thing that will throw off any kind of app statistic that you read is gaming. A huge portion of both app stores is taken up by gaming and games. And people do spend a lot of time in the game apps trying to beat levels and stuff like that. And so these kinds of things, you can see, the growth in the number of apps and the growth in the amount of time spent in apps. But a lot of that is because so much of the stores are dominated by games. And once people beat a game, they need a new game. So a lot of the new apps are games that are just being reimagined and rebranded and republished, whereas there's not as much new app making coming out in things like utilities, mapping technology, anything that's not games. There's less pressure to constantly be creating new stuff, and the important factor comes much more down to branding, brand recognition, and kind of creating the viral engagement. And so you can see this is the top 10 mobile apps worldwide in 2020 by downloads. And so you can see overall, it's the things where people are connecting with their friends, the social networks, and then really the overall, it's almost all social networks where there's long-term engagement or communication back and forth. And then when you get to the App Store, you start to see Gmail and Google Maps come into the picture, and YouTube. And when you get to Google Play, you see a little bit of Google Meet, but it's still mostly the social networks and the long-term engagement. Those are where people are downloading, even though these are things that you don't download and delete usually. So what this means is all of these downloads are by people who are new to the social network or getting a new phone. And that's how strong they are, is immediately when you get a new phone, there's a certain set of apps that you download, and that new phone contingency is driving a lot of this, compared to people who would just casually go to the App Store and go like, oh, maybe I need a new app. That really just doesn't happen. So that's another way to think about the app versus web question. And so in terms of consumer spending, there are other things to think about too. Are people spending more money in their apps versus on websites? And that tends to depend a little bit. We tend to see people spending a little bit more in the App Store, and that may have something to do with the demographic of people who have iPhones versus people who have Android phones. Since iPhones are more expensive, we usually assume that iOS users tend to have a little bit more disposable income, but it's good to know if you are building an app that people are spending more and more money in their apps. Now, when you compare that to website, it's not always a fair comparison because again, people now have started spending money in apps or in game apps even to buy more lives or things like that. So just the caution here is to, when you get data, make it as specific as possible, because if you're looking at just time spent in site or money, consumer spending in apps, the game contingency is so large that it's going to throw off any statistic. So just be careful and think a lot about the statistics. Don't take them on face value, because everyone who's publishing app statistics is also usually publishing app marketing tools or app development tools. Okay, so let's get into the real nitty-gritty of mobile SEO. So Google's been making a lot of changes to how they understand and index the web, but some of these changes are really big and important and some aren't. I'm still going to talk about the basics of mobile SEO and what you have to understand and how the things fit together. And that usually comes down into three categories of things: architecture, user experience, and on-SERP optimization. And on-SERP optimization is the newest thing that desktop SEOs spend a little bit less time on, but mobile SEOs spend a little bit more time on. So let's get an overview. The first thing that you have to know, if you don't know it already, is that between mobile and desktop searches, you can get different results. And sometimes those different results are a bit sneaky and insidious because they don't show up in Google Search Console. And they don't even necessarily show up in the other tools like SEMrush or Ahrefs. So what I'm showing you here in this query, it's how to train a dog. And what you can see on the left in the mobile result is there's what we call a featured snippet, that paragraph of black text at the top that's showing up above the video. But in desktop, there's no featured snippet. We have in both of them, the AKC shows up in the search result, but for the mobile one, the AKC shows up at the top, and in desktop, it's actually lower down, and you go straight from the ads to the video experience. And so that's something that if you're only checking when you're at work, usually people who are at work are checking on they're like, oh, let's just see what shows up in Google. Number one, that is not super reliable way to test SEO results. But number two, if you're only testing on desktop, you're not getting the full understanding of what might be taking traffic or taking eyeballs away from you if you're not also checking in mobile. Other things that can happen is the presentation in mobile changes a lot in some cases, and it can be much more compelling in mobile than desktop. So this is the same search results side by side as well. And what you can see is that you get really nice looking carousel of how-to steps, and you get images included. And these same search results, when they're on desktop, they do have the step-by-step. If you can see, there's a 1, 2, 3 that shows up where the meta description normally would, but it's not as engaging because it's not a carousel that you can scroll. It doesn't have cute pictures of dogs and stuff like that. And you can also see in the second one, on mobile, you get the big blue title tag, you get the description, and you get a icon next to the URL, and you get the image. In desktop, you get none of that. It's much more bland. And Google does this because they know mobile users are kind of in a rush. They are often like moving faster, and so you need to get their attention with more visuals. So often you will see more visuals in the mobile search result. But again, these are things that might not come out in any of the reporting tools that you use. SEMrush isn't telling you that you necessarily have a carousel here, but not on desktop, or that you have pictures included here, but not on desktop. It's really kind of buried, if it's there at all, in any of the tools, which is why we took the time to create this tool where you can put in a keyword and any location you want, specific down to the address, because that's how Google works. Google doesn't go state by state or country by country. They're actually using real GPS settings. And they're using your language settings on your computer or your phone, and changing those can actually change results as well. So we let you get all of the information in there and say, in this specific circumstance, I just want to see, what does it look like when you compare desktop to mobile? Or you can actually compare iOS to Android. We have 50 phones in there, so you can do a lot of different comparisons, whatever you want to see and whatever you want to know. But there are a lot of things that can change that people kind of forget about when you're talking to SEOs. They kind of get wrapped up in the weeds sometimes. But like scrolling down in this same result, what you can see when I just search for dog training, in mobile, the first couple of results are dominated by ads. And they're pushing things down. Now on desktop, you can also see that the top of the result is completely dominated by ads. Everything you're seeing with the blue links on the left in both mobile and desktop is ads. A lot of SEOs like to ignore the ads, and they're like, well, that's PPC, we don't do that. But that's not going to be like pretending they don't exist doesn't take away the impact that they might have on your search result. If you have 3 ads on mobile, it's pushing every organic result down further and further. And that includes knowledge graphs. So for instance, on desktop, you have the ads and you have the knowledge graph on the right. In this mobile result, you have the ads, and then you have the knowledge graph stacked below it. And then you have the first organic result. So that's going to push those 2 things stacked, push your first position ranking way down the page, possibly a third of the way or half the way down the page. And so what we thought, being kind of leaders in the mobile space, is we need to make a tool that can show people this and show how the ads impact the visibility of your first position, second position ranking, how the knowledge graph and how everything else is pushing position 1 down further and further. So what we did is we have this testing tool, and then I'll show you in a minute that we have something that also gives you the actual rank and the traditional rank. Actual rank includes everything. It includes PPC, it includes knowledge graph, it includes everything that might occur above you. Then you can compare that to traditional rank, which SEOs like to think that only traditional rank exists. If you're position 1, you're at the top. That's just not true anymore. So we have actual rank, traditional rank, and we also measure the pixels from the top in every search result for every position. So we can say, when your traditional rank is number 1, the average actual rank is this, and the average pixel rank from the top for position 1 is this, or for position 2 is this. And I think as we move into the future, as Google starts getting more and more rich, experiential things that they put at the top of the search result with pictures and expanders and carousels, those are interactive and appealing in a mobile use case. And they're going to take more than their fair share of traffic, eyeballs, and engagement because they have the interactivity and because they're pushing anything organic down in favor of often things that are hosted or recombined and lifted from websites by Google. So that's the risk. And that's why one of the reasons that I think that we really do need to talk about mobile SEO as a different thing, or at least acknowledge that when Google adds stuff in on desktop, it's often on the right. It's not pushing organic down as much, but when Google does it in mobile, it's always or almost always going to push things down in your organic position 1. So we need to get more realistic about what does position 1 really mean, and is position 1 even half of what it used to be with all the cool stuff that's sometimes being stacked on top, or just the ads. So there's a lot of nuance in mobile development that people don't talk about in desktop development, because you can say, oh, well, we want a hybrid app, or we want a PWA, or we want a native app, or we want just a responsive website. And the truth is that all of these have different strategies for getting them to rank, but for everything that's not the responsive website, the best strategy for getting the native app, the PWA, the hybrid app, to get anything that's not a website ranking is to link it to a website. When you want your native app to rank, the best way is to set up lots of really good deep links between your web content and your app content, and that's going to get you the fastest downloads to your native app. Same thing with PWAs. Except a little bit reversed. A PWA is a website that looks and behaves like an app. You build it as a website, then you make a couple changes and submit it as an app. But the core and the crux of ranking, whatever you end up building, often comes more from the website than any kind of app code. And it's usually the website is the best way to drive rankings, even for non-website content. So the biggest change that Google has made in the past couple of years has been this switch to mobile first indexing. Now, what that means is that when Google crawls the web, it used to crawl and index pretending to be a desktop browser. And so it was rendering, or it was asking for the desktop version of the page, rendering for desktop, getting this big, wide, rich experience. But since the demographics and uses of mobile have switched, and now more than half of search queries come from mobile, Google is like, oh gosh, if all of these search queries are coming from mobile, we need to make sure that our mobile experience is treated with the same priority, or in this case, more priority than the desktop experience. And that sounded good to Google, but the problem was a lot of websites were building more content for their desktop users and keeping the mobile version of the site really thin and light, making it really JavaScripty and appy to make it feel like a native app, but potentially harder for Google to crawl. So now Google has said, we crawl as a mobile phone first, and if you have stuff that's on your desktop content, or your desktop code even, that's not in the mobile version of the page or the mobile rendering of the page, we might not get it. And so that's been pushing webmasters to make sure that all the content they have on desktop is also available on mobile, and it's available in a way that Google can crawl easily and index. And that includes code things that we do, like canonical tags or hreflang or any kind of links. You know, a lot of sites will change their navigation between mobile and desktop, and they may trim the navigation for mobile, but that might mean now that anything that's trimmed out is just not going to get crawled and indexed, or those pages that were linked to in desktop are just going to have fewer internal links pointing to them if Google's crawling only as mobile. So if you haven't already, this is what you need to do, is make sure that the content between mobile and desktop is basically the same, and the code. And any kind of robots instructions or any SEO that SEO elements that you've put in the code of desktop need to be mirrored on mobile. Now, the other thing that's been around a lot longer is what we call mobile friendliness. And there is a difference between mobile first and mobile friendliness. Mobile first means that Google is crawling as a mobile phone. Mobile friendliness came before mobile first, and it was just basically saying, have a good user experience on mobile. So this graduation from mobile friendly to mobile first is kind of the upping of the ante. Google says, not just be usable on mobile, but be crawlable, indexable, and optimized on mobile. Now, when Google launched mobile friendliness and the mobile friendliness update, MobileGeddon is what it was called, And the main thing that Google wanted you to do is make sure that your JavaScript and your CSS was crawlable. And that was because they were starting to learn to render websites. They weren't just reading the text and the code. They wanted to see the CSS to know, what does this actually look like? And how big is this text? Or how small is this text? Or how important is this text? And they wanted to start understanding JavaScript, because in the old days of SEO, Google would basically ignore JavaScript. But they needed to start getting better at it because they saw that that was the direction that the web is going. And even John Mueller has said, you can't just ignore JavaScript. JavaScript is important and not going away. And instead of ignoring JavaScript, Google is now doubling down and trying to get really great at understanding and indexing content that's in JavaScript. But that is done by what we call rendering. So crawling is just kind of looking at the page, but rendering is actually imagining or pretending we have to be the browser that shows the page. So knowing where things go. And the other thing that plays into this is responsive design. So Google pushed really hard in the mobile friendliness update to say, instead of having a separate mobile site and desktop site, like an MDOT, that you need to put everything on one set of URLs and make it work, make it flexible so that it just reorganizes itself on the different devices. This is better for Google because it means they don't have to index everything twice. And it means that they can really understand the link graph. When we used to have two different versions of a website, most of the links would go to desktop versions of a page. Very few links would go to mobile versions of a page. But with mobile first indexing, if that were the case, then Google's potentially ignoring a lot of the link understanding that they would get with all the links that were only going to mobile or only going to desktop and not mobile. So that's another thing to understand is responsive is important because it's easier for Google to crawl and index only once. It makes it easier for you to know what's on every page because you're not, building this page, then that page in two different iterations. And because it gives Google the ability to understand the link graph, which helps it know when you should rank. So the other thing that's happened recently is technology has improved, especially cloud organized technology. And so a lot of the more sophisticated websites have gone from responsive to adaptive. And responsive is where there's one set of code that's being served and reorganized. Adaptive is where you're using the cloud to decide what and how to serve your content and how to organize it based on a detection of what browser is requesting it. Is it a phone? Is it a desktop? Is it a tablet? And so it only sends what's needed, which is great. It can be faster. But it can also be harder to troubleshoot if you have a lot of different adaptations for, this is what we're showing to this iPhone, and this is what we're showing to this Android, and this is what we're showing to a tablet. That gets harder to troubleshoot because most SEOs will just, do a view source on a desktop version of the page. And so you're not getting a fair comparison, or maybe they're more sophisticated and they know not to just do a view source, they inspect element, but that's still only looking at what's been sent to the desktop version of the page and not the mobile version of the page. And so that's another reason that we ended up building tools like this, where you can not only see what a search result looks like, you can see what a page looks like and fully interact with it side by side on mobile and desktop. So this, you can even see the animations are going, all the links are clickable. It's like using either device. And so you can see, oh, did we forget to include the summer special on swimsuits in the mobile animation? Or are we not, how far down is this thing that's showing above the fold on desktop, but where is that on mobile? So you get to troubleshoot it. And I'll show you in a minute, but we also have the ability to compare the code. So the code that creates the page and see how is the code different from page to page. Now, the other thing that Google cares a lot about is legibility. And this was part of the mobile friendliness update too, where they started using things like the mobile friendly test and Search Console to tell you when your content was hard to read. And so Google started giving people warnings and saying, hey, your content is hard to read, or this is styled really weird, or there's not enough contrast in the color, or what have you. And even if you're not set up in Google Search Console, which you should be, but even if you're not, you can use the mobile friendly test to see how is Google evaluating the mobile friendliness of your pages, and are they causing problems according to Google or not? Because if Google thinks your page isn't mobile friendly, they're not going to show it. Now, the fun thing about the mobile friendly test is you can use it on any site. You can use it on your site or your competitor's site. So if you're looking to mimic something that a competitor is doing, make sure that you know that it's getting counted as mobile friendly, or that you're doing a better job of making things more mobile friendly than they are. And the mobile friendliness test, of course, does use the mobile version of the page, and it'll show you, it'll only show you the top part of the rendering, but it'll show you all of the HTML that the crawler might get. So that can be a really good tool for troubleshooting any kind of problems that Google sees. But the main thing that you might see is if you're doing things and not testing, you want to make sure that Google gets all of the links in a page, in the mobile version of the page, because the link graph is still really important. And a lot of JavaScript is used to manage mobile navigation. And so you need to make sure, that Google is getting all of the links. And that means having full HTML links embedded in your JavaScript. You can't just have on-click events. Google wants it to be a full link that's coded in HTML. And even though they're getting better and better at crawling and rendering JavaScript, they have these things where they're like, they won't count that link, and they might not crawl that link unless it has the HTML version of the page. And so when Google crawls and indexes, it does two passes of a page. First, it's going to go and get what it would normally get in the old days. It'll get the code and scrape all the HTML out of there. And then it goes back to render the page and compare and make sure it understands how everything fits together. Now, we have seen situations where in the early days, these two processes could be like a week apart. But now they've gotten much closer together. But if Google gets one thing on the first pass and a different thing on the rendered version, that can cause a lot of confusion. And the way that would happen is if you have one set of title tags and robots instructions and href lang that's in your HTML, and then you're accidentally overwriting it with React Helmet or something like that, and you haven't matched up all the code that's in there, you're going to cause confusion. And every time Google recrawls and indexes the site, it might see two different sets of metadata. And if one is better than the other, you might see a really volatile page until Google really understands it. So it's best to really understand what happens in both, what happens pre-rendering and what happens post-rendering, and make sure all of those elements are the same, even just on the mobile page. So same between pre-rendered and post-rendered on mobile, and same between pre-rendered and post-rendered on desktop. And so that's the process that Google goes through. So what we did is we created the Page Datalyzer. So we used to just let you look at the page and compare mobile to desktop or mobile to mobile. Now we capture the HTML of the code, rendered and unrendered. We have a diff checker. That's the pink and green, what you're seeing. So it compares the code between rendered and unrendered so you can know what's being added. And we do this over time. So you can see this carousel of small phones at the top. We grab a full screenshot of the page. We grab the HTML, whatever you set. So we can do iOS, Android, what have you, and grab that code. And then you can do a live diff checker. And we're about to add something that puts stars on a timeline that says it changed here, it changed here, it changed here. So that way you can go back and, like, let's say a page all of a sudden, or a page loses rankings, but it happened 2 months ago. And you're like, well, what happened on that page 2 months ago? how do we know? If you're a big site like Target that changes things all the time, there might be, no way, or you have to dig through JIRA tickets to find out what went live, or beg a developer to help you. But this captures it for you, so you can know what was live on what page when, and what did the code look like before and after. So you can really troubleshoot changes in rankings, and know what was working and what was not, and find out when things changed, right? So that's super, super useful. That tool also lets you check the page experience. And so the live version of the page is fully clickable, and you can even go all the way through conversion. So it's also great for UX testing on the different devices, phone, and all the different phones, and on desktop. And it's, you can go all the way through conversion. You can put your credit cards in. I don't recommend it, but it is secure. So you could if you wanted. You absolutely buy things from our tools on your own site. But the main thing is just understanding that code is getting more and more sophisticated with all of this JavaScript rendering and the adaptive design where things are decided in the cloud and then spit out as code. And there are different degrees to which that can hurt or help crawling and indexing. And just knowing that things have gotten much more complicated, and a view source on the desktop version of your page is just not going to cut it anymore. Now, the other thing to know, as Bernard mentioned, is the experience update has launched. That's actually about how quickly and accurately your pages render. And what you think about is, what's Google's limitation in crawling and indexing the web? Well, it's how fast can they do it? They don't crawl everything every day because they have limitations. They're a business too. So their idea is make sure pages render faster and in a stable way that we can render and understand it and parse it, so that we get more efficiency. Like, that's what this update is about making the Google bot more efficient when it's trying to render your page to understand what's going on. And so when you think about it that way, this is their goal. They know that the web is growing and it's not getting smaller, right? We're always producing new pages and it's going to continue to grow. And so when they have to do this thing, rendering pages, which is hard and more time consuming and more energy consuming, they need to find a way to incentivize web developers to make that process faster when they crawl it, so that they can continue to crawl and index the web in an efficient way like they always have. So think about that in this context. When you're thinking about the experience update, are you making the page fast enough to render, or are you causing their renderer to get confused or to have to slow down and wait for you? And user experience, of course, does change from mobile to desktop. Other things that can cause problems are the size of your buttons. And so just make sure that you're doing a good job updating your pages to be a good experience on mobile. But the experience update is actually not so much about mobile friendliness as it is about the experience of the rendering for the bot. I think it's a misnomer. I think it's a distraction to call it. It's not about user experience. It's about rendering quickly for the bot. And so the last thing I'll talk about is On-SERP Optimization. So with On-SERP Optimization, this is really important for mobile SEO, because what we talked about is all the stuff that's getting stacked on top of your organic rankings. Sometimes the normal results on a mobile phone can be boring, just like desktop, where it's just blue links and black text, and that's pretty much it. But more often than not, you're getting things that we call rich results, or rich cards, or carousels, or knowledge graph, or any of the other, I think the number is now 26 or 27 different kinds of Google hosted assets or Google scraped assets that they can represent and make a search result look more interesting. And this is what they want to do, but like we talked about, it's often happening on mobile, and sometimes not as common for the same result to look as good or as rich on desktop. So this is why you really need to know and look, and not just trust numeric rankings, because there's more to getting the click than ranking number one. You've just got to optimize and add the schema so that Google can find the right assets on your page to do this kind of thing. And so in mobile SEO, we look at How can we help Google understand what we're doing to find the right stuff on the page to then show it in a search result to drive more clicks? And that's really about entities, where ClearScope comes in. Because when mobile first indexing started launching, I immediately started calling it entity first indexing, because the additional time that they take to render the page, I think, is also playing out in understanding the language on the page and the entities, and how all of the stuff on this page relates to what Google already knows about this topic from the knowledge graph and from what they call the topic layer. So they're going to a page and saying, this page seems to be about this concept. What do we know about this concept? And does this page have all of the things that make it seem like a valid page about this concept? And if it doesn't, then it might struggle to rank. And so we do a lot more focus on schema optimization and testing the natural language of a page, because what we've seen is if you put text into Google's natural language API and say, what entities can Google find here? And then you make sure your page has those same entities, you're going to race to the top of the search results. Google is not just reading text in a vacuum, looking at your page without looking at other things too. And it's not just comparing text versus text or links versus links. It's looking at the idea and how good of a representation of that idea are you. And so the way I talk about entity indexing is I talk about, because SEOs get wrapped up in keywords and have a hard time understanding the difference between entities and keywords. And so this is how I explain it. An entity is a thing that is language agnostic, that has the same relationship to other things in any language, with it, whatever language keyword you describe it with. So if I say mother, mother has the same relationship to daughter and son and father and grandmother. Regardless of what language I say those words in, those links are the same. And so that's what makes Google really understand things now, is they've stepped things back one layer from keywords to entity understanding, so that they can machine learn the web in an entity or in a language agnostic way. So they get way more data and way more understanding about topics way faster, because the understanding used to be broken up into silos by language. But if they take it back a level, they get to the entity understanding, and then they can match what you have on your page to what they know in a bigger, faster way. And that's also super important for mobile first indexing. So Bernard, I know that we've run out of time. And we want to save some time for Q&A. So I'm just going to skip to the end and tell you that you can compare lots of different things like maps and Google Knowledge Graph as well. And our PageScope actually lets you track Knowledge Graph, which is super important to the entity. If you have a static link for your Knowledge Graph, you can drop it in our PageScope and see how your Knowledge Graph changes over time. And you can parse all of the SERP results, and you can claim stuff that's not just your website, but that's your social profiles and who you are that make up your entity. And we give you a score called a Moxie score. So anything that shows up in your SERP, you can claim, and we understand that it's you forevermore. And so your Facebook, your knowledge graph, your Twitter, those start counting to you for SEO, because I think SEOs should be getting credit for that stuff too. And even articles, if someone wrote a nice article about you or you're in a top 10 list, claim that, because that's SEO work that you should be getting credit for. And that's why we created it, is we want to put it in the Moxie score so you can have a fair evaluation of everything that's SEO that you've done, not just where is position 1 on this keyword. And so that is the idea. And I'll stop there. Is that okay, Bernard?
Yeah, that was a very eye-opening presentation, at least for myself. I recognized that I was getting presented with different search results on my mobile device, but it's not until you like put both of them results next to each other where I'm like, oh wow, it's like radically different in some cases. And I feel like being aware of that idea, one, is very powerful, and two, just gets my gets my creative juices flowing, right? It's like, okay, optimizing for mobile is, well, A, very important, but B, seeming like it's kind of a different field in of itself, right? I feel like if anything, Google has been making a lot more changes in the mobile index versus the desktop index because there's, I guess, less like screen real estate to work with. So I feel like, yeah, paying attention to that, it's pretty interesting. Want to open it up for question and answer if anybody has any. I have like a couple that just came to my mind as you were talking. You mentioned, right, this idea that there's a lot more mobile visuals that are showing up on the mobile index, and that Google's becoming more interested in presenting users with rich interactive elements. There's like 28 of them that I think you kind of pointed out here or there, but it's like, if you were to use your SEO clairvoyance, what are other types of these elements that you see Google possibly rolling out to users in the upcoming years?
Well, so Google rolls out utilities a lot that users find useful, but that companies feel, and SEOs especially, feel really hurt about. So for instance, Maps is great, but the hotels thing, where hotel SEO is now all about optimizing Google's understanding and Google's representation of your hotel in their own utility. And Google, has flights. And so those things, when Google makes it, they've vetted it, they've tested it on mobile, they don't need to crawl it. So they rank it at the top. They're like, we know it's good. But that can push, number one, the value that any organic listing can have down. But number two, it can change the way we conceptualize SEO.
Yeah.
Because I like, when we introduced this Moxie's core concept, it's because I think that SEO needs to evolve to keep up with what's actually ranking. And so if Google's going to do, now Google has Google Jobs, where you can send an indexing feed for all of your jobs. If Google's going to keep doing this, that's what's going to rank. And you can be mad about it, and you can say you're going to take your ball and go home, but it's Google's game. And if you take your ball and go home, they do not care. So you've got to play.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Of all of these like different things that you brought up as well, like something else that came to my mind out of like architecture, user experience, right? On-SERP optimization. It's sort of like, okay, I know a lot of people make mistakes when it comes to using more modern like JavaScript frameworks, because a lot of that's client-side rendering, and Google's not as capable of rendering that as they've been with like server side. So outside of the entire bucket of idea that like, okay, Google can't even render your content, what would be the biggest mistakes that you see people make when it comes to mobile SEO? And then on the flip side of that, what do you think Google is most interestingly like weighting in terms of, like the 100% of their algorithm? Do you think they're allocating like 20 or 30% of that algorithm to page load speed? Or, is there a bigger bucket of things that you're like, okay, Google optimizing that gets you kind of, the majority of the way to like mobile SEO hygiene, like good mobile SEO hygiene?
Yeah. So the first question was, what's the biggest mistake that comes in when you introduce lots of JavaScript? And the main thing is overwriting the optimization that you have with like blank fields, right? Because let's say I'm talking to a developer and I'm like, all right, so this is going to be built in React. We must use React Helmet to make sure that the stuff is, all of the tags are in there. And so the developer gets the React Helmet, they load that up, but they forget to import any of the title tags or any of the important information. They're just like, we did React Helmet, what do you want us to do? And it's like, no, you have to populate that with the stuff, because it's going to overwrite what we have had in place for years in the regular HTML as blank.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah, and then the follow-up question.
The other funny thing is, I've seen where SEOs gave better instructions and they put in like square brackets, like fill in title tag here, and that's what gets indexed, because they Read the instruction.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we've worked with sites in the past where it was exactly just this nightmare of like unraveling JavaScript, and you can't even find a view, or the internal linking architecture is all just stuffed into the JavaScript itself, right? So Google's not even able to find all of the other pages except that they list them in the sitemaps. But then people will be like, okay, yeah, you're telling me these pages exist and I can load them because you've given me your sitemap, but I can't find the way to them on your like site. So I'm just gonna think of these pages as really crappy because you're not even linking to them, so why should I? So
Right.
yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that that's like the most common problem.
One more that I'll give you,
Yeah,
and then I'll answer your other question because I remember it. One more is if you, this is a hack that most people don't know. Well, not a hack, but it's an answer to hard questions.
Okay.
Sometimes you'll have pages that Google comes back with an error on in the mobile friendliness testing, and then it says it's okay in the live testing, and then it says it's not, and you're like, why do these tools not match? Or what's the problem? Because when I check the mobile friendly test, it's fine, but Google keeps saying this in Search Console. The answer is about load time. What happens when Google's getting the stuff in Search Console is they're crawling and rendering fast and throwing errors when things don't work. The mobile friendliness test sometimes does JavaScript a little bit differently, but more likely it just gives you a little bit more time to load the stuff and process the test. And so if you have bad load time when Google's crawling and indexing, it's going to throw errors because maybe it didn't load the full style sheet. And so your navigation looks like it's all layered on top of each other. And it's going to say these links are way too close together. And it's because it ran out of time to fully load the style sheet or load the JavaScript and arrange the page the way it's supposed to be arranged. So you may not actually have a problem with your links being too close together. You may have a load time issue that's causing it to look like that. So it gives you sometimes false feedback. And then the other question you asked is like, what is the biggest thing in Google's algorithm? Is it load time or anything like that? And I don't think that necessarily the algorithm has changed. And a lot of the time when Google talks, they say these things are tiebreakers. Load time is a tiebreaker. Rendering experience is a tiebreaker. So I think that links are still important. As much as Google wants to get away from links, they still need them. But it's really about relevance and quality, authority, expertise, and trust. It's about those things and how they match up and link up to the knowledge graph. Because if you think about it, an entity is modified by its EAT. If I'm writing about Tom Cruise and I have no authority or previous writing on Tom Cruise, then Google's going to say like whatever. If I'm writing about Tom Cruise and I'm his biographer and I've written many articles about Tom Cruise or whoever, they're going to say she knows about this because we see the book and we see the other articles.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I gave a talk about like how I perceive SEO to be working, and I feel like the idea of tiebreaker was my idea of like thinking about a lot of the technical search engine optimization considerations as negative impactors or detractors from your site, right? If your page loads slowly, Google's going to be like, okay, negative 100 points or whatever like that. And, if you obviously have enough technical debt, SEO technical debt, then that itself is going to pull down the like ability of your content to rank. But at the end of the day, if you have the best content on it, that still might offset all of these little technical cuts that your website is suffering from. But if you fix all of those and you had no great content, you can imagine that your baseline back at like 0 points, because it's like, okay, well, there's nothing wrong with your site, so we'll start you off at 0, but really, where's the content? Where's the quality relevant backlinks? That's what's going to like push you higher up. So I think that makes a ton of sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we're about at time, and we've had a less quiet or a more quiet audience this time around. I think mobile SEO is something that is it's pretty interesting myself, and I'm glad that you took the time to give our audience a chat. Are there any other just last bits of wisdom that you would like to share with the audience or with anybody or about mobile SEO or maybe about MobileMoxie?
Yeah, sure. If you think of any questions after the fact, feel free to tweet to me. My screen name on Twitter is Suzix, and that's better than email for me. And if you're interested in trying any of the tools that I showed, I made them available for free for 30 days with the promo code ClearScope, all caps. And people talk about MobileMoxie, and the tools that people mostly know are the SERPerator and the PageScope. And the newer tools that we just launched are the Datalyzers, so the Page Datalyzer and the SERP Datalyzer. And those are the long-term view where we track things over time, whereas the SERPerator and the PageScope are just like one-time testing. What does it look like right now? The Datalyzers are the over time, really digging in and understanding. So we're super excited about those. But it's a different way of looking at SEO. So you have to kind of open up your brain.
Yeah, absolutely. Give mobilemoxie.com, give it a shot. I think it's a really cool and interesting way to gain awareness about what's happening with mobile SEO and also convince potentially your leadership that changes need to be made. You need more budget on the SEO or content side because X, Y, or Z is happening, or even diagnosing a lot of potential problems that you didn't even know your site had, right? So go check it out. We'll send a recap email where it has the promo code, links to obviously checking out the website and following Cindy on Twitter. And yeah, thanks for having us, and thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is great. Thank you.
All right, take care, y'all.